Right, hello everyone. Good morning. Welcome again to Elevenses. It's another reasonably nice day here in London today, as we come to the end of, I think it's, isn't it, sixth week of lockdown, and there are hints out there that things may be released, although Boris seems to have got himself into a little bit of a tangle in terms of exactly what's going to happen and when. There seems to be some rowing back going on in the news at the moment about exactly what will happen when. Um, but what I want to talk about this morning is how motorcycling might go after lockdown. Now, um, don't forget, if you can't stay tuned to the show all the way to the end, you can catch it here on the catch up system. And you'll also find it on YouTube later today, as are all the other old shows. So do stay tuned if you can, but if you can't, go and find it on catch up. I'll be finishing off with a look at some more motorcycle maintenance topics. I'll basically be bringing that particular subject to a close. Hopefully, it'll have given you some help to keep your bikes in good nick over the lockdown period. If you have something to say or a question to ask, you can use the comment box as always, and I'll get back to you as soon as I get off live air. And suggestions. I'm always open to suggestions for anything else to talk about. So also feel free to drop me a line. Right. Okay. So where are the roads going to go after lockdown? Now, it's a question that we probably should be asking right now because decisions are being taken right at this moment, which are very likely to affect us for the long term. Now, on the one hand, we have the green lobby. And the further extreme is the idea that all journeys that aren't undertaken by human power are fundamentally unnecessary, which leads us to the idea that planes should be grounded and we should walk or cycle everywhere. Now, that has the benefit that energy consumption will be minimized to the point where our impact on the planet is negligible. And okay, diametrically opposed to that, of course, is the fossil fuel industry and everything that is based around fossil fuels, including the automotive industry. And they pretty much want us to continue to travel by car and plane. I was reading an article only this morning, which was talking about the challenges of lockdown and how people are going to bounce back, and arguing that dealers should be investing basically in cars for lease as opposed to for sale. So, some people will see this as a reason to get back into the car. The problems are, or what they will argue, is that problems with the pollution and climate change are exaggerated or solvable by the next generation. In other words, what they want is business as usual. Now, realistically, it's hard to see either extreme as either practical, achievable, or sustainable. But lockdown has certainly shown us some of the benefits of a greener Earth. I don't know if you're a stargazer or not, but here in central London, I'm seeing stars at night as if I was out in the country, even allowing for the light pollution. We've had some really fantastic displays of stars. And the full moon just a couple of nights ago was spectacularly clear, with detail visible through binoculars I've not seen probably since I was a kid. And that gives us a clue how much the air has cleaned up in the UK. In India, people living in the northern plains are seeing the Himalayas for the first time in several generations. The air basically is cleaner right across the world. We all benefit from that. And it's going to be a challenge to basically pollute the planet again to the amount that we have been doing. Here in the UK right now, vehicle use is down by more than 60% as people cutting out non-essential travel. Many of us are working from home. Some are furloughed, others have already been laid off. But there's a catch. We live in a society where people travel more than ever before. So what happens when we come out of lockdown? There will be huge pressure to move the country towards a global economic recovery. We're already seeing that in the USA, but we're starting to have that debate here in the UK, and also in Europe. Now, as things stand at the moment, millions have lost their jobs already, and millions will continue to lose jobs right across the world. So maintaining what jobs we can, creating new jobs, getting people to and from work all requires mobility. Raw materials, manufactured goods, and workers all need to travel. So the challenge for the authorities is a huge one. Cities, in particular, are built on moving a high density of population from one place to the other for the minimum of cost in the minimum of time. Now, few of us live near our work, and that means most people commute. Now, for many years here in the UK, of course, there's been a drive to get people onto public transport to cut the use of the private car. How successful has that been? Well, the answer is the success is mixed. Now, in London, there were 4 million tube journeys a day before lockdown. We're down to about 200,000 at the moment. There were even more bus journeys, 5.5 million. That's down to about a million a day at the current rate. The average commuting time for those travelling by rail was an hour, and that tends to suggest that those using trains need to cover bigger distances, greater distances. But the question on everybody's mind is, how does public transport cope with the need to maintain social distancing? Clearly, getting back on the tube or onto a train or into a bus is not going to be acceptable at the levels of sardine-like packing that was achievable before COVID-19. So we're not going to get anything like the numbers into transport that we could do before the crisis. And of course, many people won't want to be using the public transport anyway for that very reason. The survey that was carried out just recently of 1,100 Londoners, in fact, found that 72% of all Londoners felt rather differently about using public transport than before the pandemic. Presumably, most of those would probably be doubtful about using it. Now, how can we get around that? Well, flexible working offers a partial solution. Some workers can probably stagger their working hours, reducing the peak demand on public transport. Others can undoubtedly make a more or less permanent move to work from home. Others, yet more, can do some of their work at home, some of their work in the office. Now, that will all help to reduce commuter numbers. One study, again, suggested that up to 24% of those who answered the survey said that they plan to work from home more often. And 67% said that they believed that virtual meetings could actually replace some or all of the business trips that they currently do. So there is a way of getting people out of public transport and reducing the load on it. One estimate suggests that the number could be 20% lower across the country, and with an even greater drop in London. But that still probably doesn't reduce numbers enough. Buses and tubes, they say, could fall to as much as 40% from the current pre-lockdown standards. I'll phrase that again. Some studies are suggesting that the usage of buses and tubes after lockdown could be showing a drop of 40% from pre-lockdown levels. Rail use could drop by as much as 27%, but again, that's probably not enough to allow for the social distancing that's needed. And in any case, if you reduce the travel costs, the travel numbers, you absolutely impose a challenge to those public transport operators because their revenue will drop in turn. So until public confidence in transport returns, until the coronavirus crisis is over, we've got a problem with public transport in more ways than one. So what about people who must travel? Well, a survey of Londoners, again, found that 7% of those expecting to reduce their use of buses and trains were now looking for a car. 6% said they were planning to learn to drive. So that may not sound a lot, but a bump of 6 or 7% in terms of road traffic in London would be significant. The AA commissioned a survey, and they suggested that maybe 1 in 10 will opt to work from home more than they do before, and that maybe 22% of people will generally drive less, but half will drive just as they always did, and that 1% suggests that they'll drive more. So that could be the people we're seeing looking to buy a car or looking to pass a test. In any case, is it likely that those people, 20+% of people, will actually reduce their car usage? Well, we've had many false starts like this, fueled by good intentions. We've had surges in fuel prices, and the consequence of those is almost always a drop in road traffic. And people always say, I'm going to cut down my car use, not going to use the car so much anymore, it costs too much. And then, of course, what happens? A few months down the line, everybody gets used to the new prices and everybody starts driving again. And before we know what's happened, we are back where we are. Traffic levels haven't just bounced back, they even increase. And there is some evidence for this. Despite global passenger numbers on aircraft at the moment being down by 90%, there are reports of strong demand for winter flights when people expect to be able to move around without so many restrictions. Fundamentally, we find it hard to give up what we're used to, and we are used to traveling by car. From the industry body, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, figures released last month show that in 2019, Britain passed the 40 million mark for cars and vans on the road for the first time ever. And that was an increase of 1% over the previous year. More dramatically, it marks an increase of almost 30% in the last decade. That's how many extra cars and vans there are on the road. Now, many of those will be second cars, some will be cars for the kids, but it's not just a reflection of the fact that the society generally is better off. It's also a clear statement that people need to get around. Just think what's happened to local shops. Where are they? A lot of the high street shops have gone. It's all very well walking down the high street and having your pick of cafes and fast food outlets, but if you want to actually go shopping, it's not nearly so easy. What about your hospitals? Most hospitals have now been amalgamated into huge structures, and often they are 30, 40 miles away from where people live in rural areas. So, okay, we do need to get around. But of course, most car journeys are commutes. Around 2/3 of all car use is to travel to work. How far do we travel? Well, the average car commute in 2017 was 26 minutes long. But apparently, it's company cars that still do a significant proportion of the mileage. They're generally driven about 4 times as far as a private car. One interesting side figure, that 40 million includes 5 million light vans, and the increase in vans on the road has been driven by the growth in home deliveries, which ironically, of course, has been a bit of a benefit in the current circumstances. So if the combination of lack of trust in public transport and the need to travel to work leads to more driving, that's going to create a head-on collision with local authorities who have very different and competing visions of the future. Now, you've probably been reading about what's been proposed for the post-pandemic view of big cities like New York, Milan, Paris. They're all pushing for walking and cycling as alternatives to using motor vehicles. Now, New York is apparently creating 110 miles of bike lanes. In Germany, new laws have been introduced, which means it's illegal to overtake cyclists on narrow lanes and illegal to park in cycle lanes. Here in London, you've probably seen that the mayor's existing transport strategy, which is to get 80% of all journeys onto public transport or by walking or cycling by 2041, has been somewhat accelerated by circumstances. And this is where motorcycling is getting promoted because it's seen as a middle way, not the full return to driving, but not a full movement, a full shift to cycling and walking as an option. FEMA, the Federation of European Motorcycle Associations, and MAG Motorcycle Action Group have both released pre-biking statements in the last few days. Both have also criticised the emission of motorcycles from government thinking. Now, just a few days ago, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps suggested that we ought to be encouraging people to switch to the bicycle. And that will be a key part of proposals for transport as the travel restrictions are released gradually. But as Mag pointed out, motorcycles are not mentioned. And they do have a point. I'll have a sip of my tea for a moment. To use Mag, Director of Campaigns and Political Engagement, that's Colin Brown, to use his figures for London in 2018, the average cycle trip was 3.3 miles. The average bus trip was 3.7 miles. The average tube trip is 8.9 miles, and the average rail trip was 30.9 miles. Now, note those are averages. That means a lot will be shorter and some will be considerably longer. One Colin left out is the average car trip in London. It's actually 7.7 miles. And here's a really interesting figure. The average motorcycle trip is 13.4. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting people walking and cycling for those shorter journeys, as Colin says. But he also points out quite rightly that during lockdown, we've not all moved closer to our places of work. And I'll add that, of course, to that we've not moved closer to schools, hospitals, shops, or places of entertainment either. Now, the implication of those figures that I just mentioned, with the motorcycle trip, the average motorcycle trip being considerably longer than car, cycling, bus, is that the motorcycle fills a unique niche in London, where it offers a faster commute over longer journey distances than the car. Nevertheless, whether we like it or not, motorised traffic is going to be squeezed. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan's already announced his street space plan, which is intended to fast track the transformation of London's streets to enable millions more people to safely walk and cycle as part of the daily journeys. Now, what that basically means is that roads are already being converted at the moment with temporary measures like barriers, plastic barriers or cones, but they are being converted to wider pavements, to add cycle lanes where there weren't cycle lanes before, to produce signed cycle routes which direct cyclists along particular roads. And that means narrower car lanes and fewer car parking spaces. In some places, the car parking spaces are being removed altogether. And across the board, lower speed limits to match the increased use of pedestrianised areas and cycle lanes. And in some places, vehicles are being banned altogether. So, what role can the powered two-wheeler plan wants to come? Well, at first sight, motorcycling is a great way, isn't it? Because obviously you get that idea that you're maintaining social distancing. After all, you're sitting on your own motorcycle. And it doesn't leave commuters at the mercy of crowded trains or congested roads because you can squeeze more bikes into the space the car takes up. That's the usual explanation for the benefits of motorcycles on the roads. But we have to weigh up some cons with those pros. And the answers are probably not one that the pro motorcycle lobby would like to hear. My first point is to debunk the argument that bikes are cleaner than cars. They're not. Currently, there's no such thing as a hybrid motorcycle. Only the newest motorcycles being built right now, sold right now, will match the Euro 6 standard for cars. And with the uptake of hybrids, the emissions from cars' CO2 output has plummeted. There are now around 750,000 hybrids, ultra low emission zone compliant vehicles on the roads. And they are producing lower than, well, not, I won't say lower than ever, because at one point we had no cars, of course, but lower outputs of CO2 than we have seen for years and years and years. The existing motorcycle pool, by comparison, produces more tailpipe emissions per litre of fuel than these clean cars. And it's going to take a while for that motorcycle pool to filter through to new vehicles. And don't even get me started on the idiotic claim I heard the other day that an RD250LC is cleaner than modern cars just because it can get past the ultra low emission zone test in London. Those tests are designed for four-stroke engines, not for the emissions produced by two-strokes. Two-strokes were banned years and years ago by California because they are filthy engines. Modern two-strokes can be cleaned. Don't get me wrong. There is modern technology out there which can really, really clean up a two-stroke engine, but it's not found in an RD250. We're also regularly told that motorcycles consume less fuel than cars. Well, once again, think about it. It's only true for small capacity motorcycles. Just before we got locked down, my last trip away was out to California to see my brother and my family out there. And I did a couple of thousand miles in a hybrid Audi in California. I managed, I think, an overall fuel consumption of just over 60 mpg, well, about 63, I think it was. And that was in mixed driving. That was in Los Angeles city traffic, which, by the way, is far worse than London, if you think London's bad. On freeways, much equivalent to driving up the M1 or something like that. Mountain roads, which would be very similar to driving through the mountainous bits of Wales or Scotland, and rural roads, similar to anywhere really. Realistically, you're going to be looking at a bike of no more than 500cc, or perhaps something like the NC range that Honda's brought out, which is 500cc performance, to match those numbers. My XJ6 gets about 55 mpg, and the Tracer 900 I rode around New Zealand last year managed a fraction under 50 on the entire 3,000 mile trip. So realistically, a small car is more fuel efficient, particularly if it's a hybrid, than most motorcycles of typically 500cc and up. And there's, of course, something else a car can do that a van can do. It can carry four people, or it can carry a pallet, and it keeps the rain off. It may be practical to ride a naked scooter in Milan, but try doing that in the north of England in February on a freezing wet morning. I'm not saying bikes don't have their place, but I don't think it's the kind of bike you and I are used to seeing. People keep saying that motorcycling is the answer, but if you're a motorcyclist and saying that, you have to remember that you're making that suggestion from the perspective of the already converted. It's a very different challenge to get people out of cars and off public transport and onto two wheels. Simply rebadging a motorcycle as a substitute car isn't going to work. We need something that appeals to non-bikers. And I suggest that we go back in time and look at the 1950s. And we look at the original scooters, the Lambrettas, the Vespas, and that'll give us a clue about how to appeal to people who wouldn't normally look twice at a motorcycle. The charm and the selling point of the scooter was the very fact it wasn't a motorcycle. It was smooth, it was sleek, it was clean, and it was modern. And I think we need to look in that same kind of direction now if we're to pull people from cars onto two wheels. What do we need? Well, somewhere to store a bit of luggage would be a good idea, whether that's a shopping bag, a school bag, or a laptop. Ideally, it stores a helmet or two at the same time. I would suggest that some secure passenger capacity is required as well. If you're taking a child to school or a two-up trip with someone who's not used to going on a bike, motorcycles are pretty intimidating. Something with a sort of luggage box at the back, which is built around the passenger, is much, much more secure. What about keeping the weather off? Motorcycles don't do well at solving that problem either. I think there's a place for a bike with a roof. I meant to put a picture up for you earlier, but I've kind of forgotten. Let me see if I can get it up on the screen quickly. I've lost the picture. Hang on a minute. Where is it? There it is. Have a look at this. That's a Honda Elysium. That was released. Let me. I'll put my picture back. That was released back in 2001. It was a concept model put about by Honda. It was pretty much in competition to the Yamaha T-Max and Bergman 650, which came out at round about the same time, the so-called super scooters. Honda, of course, had to go one better, so what you're seeing is a flat four engine on that bike. It also had the interesting feature that the roof folded away when it's not needed. But in the coming months, people aren't going to be looking for premium transport. There's an estimate that 1/4 of the global workforce will be out of a job. So the market will be for budget transport. So think modified Honda PCX. I suspect that's a more likely place to go. And there's another direction that we might travel to. And again, let me just show you quickly another picture. I just need to put the glasses back on for a moment. Here we go. You may remember that little beast which I showed you a couple of weeks ago. It's the cake from Sweden, the OSA model. Now, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that the light looks like a dog's dinner. It's effectively a spine with things bolted onto it. And what that makes it is a very unique utility bike. It might look like a complete dog's dinner, but the thing is, it's built to be flexible with those modular parts. So as well as the shopping basket on the front, you can bolt the cat carrier on at the back, or you can swap that for a passenger seat. So if you're looking for an alternative to a cycle or walking because you're traveling a bit too far because you need to carry something, just even perhaps for shopping, maybe something like this makes a lot of sense. Now, this will be particularly important when all the speed limits get ramped down to 20 miles an hour. You really don't need a 500cc bike, let alone 1000cc or 1200 custom or something. A moped will do the job. There are two versions of this, a 125 equivalent and a moped equivalent. And the moped equivalent at 30 miles an hour will be quite fast enough to run through a 20 mile per hour limit. Okay, problems. Well, right now, of course, it is far too expensive as a bike. The base model of the moped equivalent is a fairly eye-watering €6,500 for the electrically powered bike you see. By the time you've added some of those accessories that you can see in front of you, you're going to push the price past the €10,000 mark, and you can add another 2K to that if you want to go for the 125 equivalent with its higher top speed but its shorter range. Now, nothing I can see on that bike is particularly high tech. I mean, electric motors have been around for 100 years plus. You've got a beam frame, you've got a standard shock at the back, you've got standard forks at the front. There's nothing there which is expensive, but everything is premium price. That welded basket on the back is a couple of €100. Quite frankly, how much does a shopping basket from your supermarket cost? The clamps are €50. That's an outrageous price for two bits of metal with a bolt through the middle. Now, add some weather shielding, however, and you have the kind of bike that you're seeing built to brave the monsoon in India and Indonesia. What could economies of scale do to the price of a bike like that? That's where I'm going to leave this discussion. Basically, I can't see motorcycles as we know them today being any more of a solution to the post-pandemic problem than the current breeds of car. And if we can't use public transport and if we're not allowed to use cars, it's in this direction that I see the market for an urban motorcycle potentially heading. I may be completely wrong. You can tell me that if you like in the comments. Right, now I promised to round off the item on bike maintenance. I know we're going to be overrunning slightly on time, but the first thing I'll say is you can have a look at your spark plugs. Do you know where they are? They're probably hidden well away out of sight. The days when you could actually change the plugs without dismantling anything on your motorcycle is long since gone. but it's an easy thing to do once you've removed the bodywork, generally speaking. You may need to fiddle around with radiators and hoses if you're really unlucky, but getting a plug out and whipping it across a feeler gauge is a forgotten task for most people. I can hear some people out there already asking what a feeler gauge is, but now's a good time to think about changing them. Then the bike will be fresh plugged for the release. Just one word of caution, you'll need a decent socket. The one in the toolkit is iffy and usually isn't a very good fit. And that's important, not so much getting them out, but when you come to put them back in again, because they should screw in literally with hand pressure alone. You should be able to just turn the top of the plug or even the plug and the plug socket and just get them going back into the plug hole without any force at all. If you do have to use force, then it may well be that you've cross-threaded the plug. And trust me, that's an awkward and an expensive fix. Don't ask me how I know. Something else I'd take a look at is the chain. If the bike's been parked up outside for any length of time and you've had any wet weather, then that rain is gradually washing your chain lube away. It may not look like it, but the side plates will dry out where they cover the rings that seal in the grease that's inside the chain, and the side plates can go rusty, and then basically you have the recipe to destroy those O-rings, those X-rings. And when you do get moving again, what you'll find very quickly is that you'll have seen off the chain almost before you start riding, and that's probably another expense that you don't need right this moment. So the first thing I would do is get the chain cleaned, get some chain cleaner. Don't use petrol. Paraffin will do, I believe, but chain cleaner is kind to the rings. And when you've got a nice clean and shiny chain, you can use an old toothbrush to clean it off, but do make sure you're wearing an old t-shirt because it does get very messy. Then use some good quality lubricant to recoat it. Generally speaking, when I'm riding, I use gear oil, which is usually what the manufacturers of the chain recommend, if not the manufacturers of chain lube. But if you're going to park up for a while, then I would use a spray-on aerosol. And what I would do before I ride the bike is I would clean it off and then use the gear oil as normal. One other tip, if you do adjust the chain, don't over tighten it. So many times do I see people either ignored the chain completely, so it's basically acting like a tank track and dragging along the ground. But if they don't do it that way, they over tighten the chain. Modern chains really don't need adjusting very often, but you do just need to keep an eye on the free play, and it must have free play. The best way to check it is not on the side stand. It's certainly not on the center stand. It's actually sat on the bike. If you do it on the center stand, when you sit on the bike, the suspension will move and the chain will almost inevitably be too tight. So take the bike off the stand if you've just did it on the stand, and then double check. All you need is a long screwdriver or a long spanner and basically give the chain a bit of a wiggle. If there's no movement at all, and I have seen the chain bowstring tight, then there needs to be some slack dialed in. You've got it too tight. Anything else to say? Something else I probably should have mentioned when I was talking about cleaning the bike was making sure that you don't use a jet wash and spray water anywhere near bearings. Those are in the wheels themselves, in the steering head, but also in the swinging arm and around the suspension linkages. All those nasty grotty places where it's very tempting to put a jet of water. Be careful. Don't use too much pressure. You can drive the grease out. If you don't have a jet washer, though, a tip from my old buddy Malk, you can use a garden pump-up spray. They're not as good as a pressure washer, but if you can't get a hose or a karcher out to the bike, it's a cheap alternative. I used to use this when I lived on a street and couldn't get anything like that out. It's a bit early in the year for a bug crop yet, but they're just starting to come out. But you might have some left over from last year's riding if you haven't cleaned the bike. It's a good idea to get rid of them, because what you'll find is that the acids in the little dead insects will actually eat your plastic. They're really tiny little pits behind. So get some bug off cleaners and get them off. The best thing to do, I find, is to get them soaked first with some soapy water, with a cloth laid over the top to keep them damp. That gets everything a little bit softer, and then you can ease them off. But what you don't want to do is scrape them off with a dry cloth or something like that, because you'll find that the chitin that these insects are made from is extremely tough, and you'll be scratching your bodywork. Anything else to do? Well, you can try cleaning up black parts like indicators and mirrors. Again, soapy water gets those clean, dried off. If they've gone a bit dull, you can bring a good finish back with some silicone spray. But be aware it's not permanent. You'll have to keep doing it, but it does look better than a faded surface. Another tip I've heard is use olive oil, but again, that'll wash off too. Best, if you can, is keep the bike out of the UV from the sun, because that's what fades the plastics. Some screens go hazy as well. Keeping the bike under wraps when it's not being ridden helps, but be careful. You can scratch the screen. I've done this myself by using a bike cover which is a bit loose and flappy in the wind and actually wrecks the screen rather than protects it. One thing you can do to stop this happening is just put an old pillowcase over the screen. That'll protect it. Rather than fork out for a new screen, I simply polished the scratches out with toothpaste. It was all I needed. It took a bit of a while, but it got the job done. It wasn't perfect, but you had to look fairly hard to see where I'd repaired it with. Exhaust pipes as well. I have to admit, clean under the engine. I can't be bothered. There's a limit to how far I'll clean a bike these days. But if you do, remember that you don't really want to be using a strong abrasive cleaner. It's very tempting to use something like Autosol on it, or even, God forbid, wire wool. Chrome's hard, but it's not that hard, and you'll basically wreck the shiny finish. So you can be a little bit more careful, a little bit less careful rather, with stainless steel pipes. But there are plenty of cleaners out there which do a reasonable job of bringing some shine back to your exhaust system. There's plenty of how-to guides on the internet too. But basically, there's no shortcuts. A lot of it is slow and hard work. Well, that's it for today. I hope you found the show interesting. Probably a little bit controversial. Probably going to get a few comments on what I've said being negative about biking, but hey ho, that's the way I see it going, and you're welcome to your own views. Only time will tell. We'll be back on Sunday at 11, and I'm going to be running an interview, part one of an interview with suspension and bike posture guru Dave Moss, and he'll be talking about how you can personalize your motorcycle to fit you and not the test rider that the factory designed it around. Okay, so I'll see you hopefully at 11 on Sunday. Don't forget you can catch up online at any time, and look forward to seeing you next time out. Bye for now.